There is a specific kind of silence you only find in the deep woods. It's not an empty silence. It's a heavy, suffocating quiet, where you can hear the blood pumping in your own ears and the snap of a single twig sounds like a gunshot. I've always been drawn to that silence. My name is Mark, and I've been an avid backpacker for the better part of a decade. 3 years ago, in late October, I decided to tackle a section of the Appalachian Trail alone. I chose the Blood Mountain Wilderness area in Georgia. It's a notoriously grueling section of the trail, full of steep switchbacks, dense pine canopies, and areas where the tree cover is so thick that it feels like twilight even at noon. Because it was late autumn, the tourist season was entirely dead. The summer hikers were long gone, and the heavy winter snows hadn't arrived yet. It was the shoulder season, the perfect time for absolute isolation. That's what I wanted. Just me, my pack, and the wilderness for 4 days. The first day was beautiful. The air was crisp, biting at my lungs in a refreshing way, and the leaves were a dying, rusted orange. I hiked for roughly 12 miles without seeing another human soul. No voices, no distant airplanes, no cell service, just the rhythmic crunch of my boots on the dead leaves. Around 4 p.m., the environment began to change. In the Appalachian Mountains, the weather doesn't just shift, it drops on you like a heavy blanket. A thick, milky fog began rolling down from the higher elevations, creeping through the trunks of the ancient pine trees. Within 30 minutes, visibility dropped to less than 50 feet. The woods took on a liminal, dreamlike quality. The trees faded into gray silhouettes, and the damp mist swallowed all sound. That's when I found the first footprint. I was walking along a relatively dry section of dirt trail, sheltered by an overhang of rock, but right in the middle of the path was a massive, fresh boot print. It was pressed deep into a patch of mud that had collected in a small depression. I stopped and stared at it. The mud was still slowly seeping into the grooves of the tread, meaning whoever made it had stepped there only minutes before I arrived. But that wasn't what made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The boot print was facing towards me. If someone was hiking the trail from the opposite direction, we should have crossed paths. I hadn't seen anyone. I hadn't heard anyone. To leave that print and not bump into me, they would have had to step off the trail and silently wait in the dense, foggy woods for me to pass. I stood completely still, straining my ears against the thick, foggy silence. Nothing. Just the slow drip of condensation falling from pine needles. I convinced myself I was being paranoid. Maybe it was an old print that just looked wet because of the fog. I tightened the straps on my backpack and kept moving, though my pace was noticeably faster. About a mile later, the trail narrowed, forcing me to brush up against the damp, mossy rock walls. That's when I heard it. It was a whistle. 4 distinct, sharp notes. It sounded human, but it lacked any melody or emotion. It was completely flat and mechanical. I froze. The whistle came from my left, deep in the thicket of trees where there was no trail. "Hello?" I called out. My voice sounded pathetic, instantly swallowed by the dense fog. No answer. I waited for 2 full minutes. Nothing. I started walking again. 10 minutes later, I heard it again. This time, it was behind me, and it was closer. Panic is a slow poison. It starts in your stomach and slowly paralyzes your rational thoughts. I knew I couldn't hike in the dark, especially not in a dense fog with someone, or something, following me. I needed to set up camp and build a fire. I found a small clearing about 50 yards off the main trail. It was nestled between 3 massive boulders, which gave me a false sense of security, protecting my back. I pitched my small, olive green solo tent as fast as my shaking hands would allow. I gathered deadwood and managed to get a respectable fire going just as the last daylight completely vanished. Night in the deep woods is absolute. Beyond the small, flickering orange glow of my campfire, the darkness was a solid, impenetrable wall. The fog glowed eerily in the firelight. I sat on a log, holding my hunting knife in my lap, eating cold protein bars because I was too terrified to boil water. Around 9 p.m., a dead branch snapped in the darkness just beyond the firelight. It was a loud, sharp crack. I stood up instantly, kicking dirt over my fire to kill the flames. Fire ruins your night vision, and right now, I needed to see into the dark. The sudden absence of light was blinding. I backed up slowly until my spine pressed against one of the cold boulders. Then, From the pitch blackness, no more than 20 feet away, came the whistle. It was so loud and close it made my ears ring. But it was what happened next that truly broke my sanity. Earlier in the day, the cold air had given me a dry cough. I had coughed twice, cleared my throat, and spit. From the darkness, I heard the exact same sound. A dry, forced double cough, a throat clearing, the sound of spit hitting the dirt. It wasn't a recording. It was a person, standing in the pitch black, perfectly mimicking the noises I had made hours ago. They weren't looking for help. They were mocking me. They were playing with me. I didn't turn on my headlamp. I dropped to my hands and knees and crawled silently into my tent, zipping the door shut as quietly as possible. I crawled into my sleeping bag fully clothed, boots still on, clutching my knife to my chest. For the next 4 hours, I lay in the suffocating darkness of that nylon tent, listening. Around 2 a.m., the footsteps started. They were slow, deliberate, heavy crunches on the dead leaves. Whoever it was had entered my campsite. They were walking in a slow circle around my tent. I held my breath until my lungs burned. I stared up at the sloped roof of my tent. The moon had finally broken through the fog just enough to cast a faint, sickly gray light through the canopy. As the footsteps circled to the front of my tent, a shadow fell across the thin fabric. It was the massive, distorted silhouette of a person standing directly outside my mesh door. The figure stood there for what felt like an eternity. Then, very slowly, a single finger dragged down the outside of the nylon tent fabric, the sound of a dirty fingernail scraping against the material. They didn't try to open the tent. They didn't speak. After dragging their finger down the fabric, the heavy footsteps slowly retreated back into the woods, fading into the silence. I didn't sleep a single second. I lay perfectly rigid until the first gray light of dawn crept into the tent. When I finally unzipped the door, my campsite was empty. But my backpack, which I had left leaning against a tree, was completely emptied out. My food, my water filter, my spare clothes, everything was scattered across the dirt. But nothing was stolen. It was just inspected and dumped. I didn't bother packing the tent. I grabbed my keys, my wallet, and my water bottle, and I sprinted back to the main trail. I didn't care about the noise. I just wanted out. I ran down the trail for about a mile before I had to stop and catch my breath. I bent over, hands on my knees, panting heavily. As I stood up to wipe the sweat from my eyes, I noticed something glinting in the morning sunlight just a few feet ahead of me on the trail. Tied securely between 2 thick pine trees, stretching perfectly across the trail at the exact height of my neck, was a length of high-tension, transparent fishing line. If I hadn't stopped to catch my breath, if I had kept running blindly down that path, it would have sliced into my throat. Whoever was out there wasn't just a drifter. They had hunted me. They had studied my path, played with my mind, and laid a physical trap for my escape. I carefully stepped under the wire and didn't stop speed walking until I reached the highway and flagged down a passing logger truck. I never reported it to the park rangers because I never saw a face, and I knew how crazy a whistling man in the woods sounded. But I have never stepped foot on the Appalachian Trail since, and whenever I hear a sharp whistle in the city, my blood still runs ice cold. My name is David, and this happened 4 years ago in the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia. The Appalachian Mountains here are ancient. The ridges roll on forever, covered in a dense, suffocating carpet of hardwood and spruce trees. I was doing a 3-day solo hike in late November. The leaves had already fallen, leaving the trees looking like skeletal fingers reaching up against the dull, gray sky. The air had that sharp, metallic bite of approaching winter. On the second afternoon, I made the classic, arrogant mistake every experienced hiker swears they'll never make. I tried to take a shortcut. I was aiming for a specific ridge and decided to veer off the marked trail, assuming my compass and topographical map would easily guide me through the 2 miles of brush. But the terrain was deceptive. What looked like a gentle slope on the map turned out to be a jagged network of deep ravines and impassable deadfalls. By 4:30 p.m., the sun dipped below the tree line. In the deep woods, sunset doesn't mean twilight. It means an immediate, heavy darkness. The temperature plummeted from 40 degrees down to the low 20s. Panic is a cold, physical weight in your stomach. I checked my GPS, but the thick canopy and the deep ravine I was stuck in blocked the satellite signal. My phone was a useless brick of glass. I was completely, genuinely lost. I knew I couldn't navigate the steep, rocky terrain in the dark without risking a broken ankle, or worse. I needed to find a flat spot to pitch my tent immediately. As I pushed through a thick cluster of rhododendron bushes, I stumbled into a sudden clearing. Sticking out against the darkening sky, silhouetted by the faint, dying gray light, was a massive, rusted steel structure. It was an old, decommissioned fire watchtower. It stood about 60 feet tall, a skeletal framework of cross-braced steel supporting a small, square wooden cabin at the very top. The metal stairs zigzagged up the side, looking brittle and orange with decades of rust. The Forest Service had abandoned most of these towers in the 1970s, leaving them to rot in the middle of nowhere. It looked creepy, but to me, it looked like salvation. Sleeping on the frozen ground in bear country while lost is a nightmare. Sleeping 60 feet in the air, inside a wooden box with a roof, sounded like luxury. I approached the base of the tower. The metal groaned slightly in the wind. The bottom staircase was intact, though the handrails were coated in a thick layer of rough, icy rust. I slung my heavy pack over both shoulders and began the climb. Every step I took echoed with a loud, hollow clang that rang out through the dead, silent forest. I hated making that much noise, but I had no choice. When I reached the wooden catwalk surrounding the top cabin, my legs were burning. I found the heavy wooden trapdoor set into the floor of the catwalk. I pushed up with my shoulders, the rusted hinges screaming in protest, and hoisted myself into the small cabin. The inside was a tiny, 8 by 8 foot room. Most of the glass windows that surrounded all 4 walls were completely shattered. The floorboards were soft with rot, and the air smelled intensely of decaying wood, dust, and old rain. But it had a roof, and it was dry. I set up my sleeping mat in the center of the room, far away from the shattered windows where the freezing wind was howling through. I ate a cold dinner of jerky and trail mix in the pitch black. I didn't dare turn on my flashlight. The last thing I wanted was to announce my location to whatever might be wandering the woods below. I zipped myself tightly into my sub-zero sleeping bag, listening to the wind violently shaking the metal framework of the tower. The whole structure swayed slightly, a sickening, creaking motion that made my stomach churn. Around 11:30 p.m., the wind suddenly died down. The sudden silence was jarring. My ears strained, trying to adjust to the quiet. I sat up and looked out the shattered window facing the south ridge. Miles away, deep in the sea of black trees, I saw a tiny, sharp prick of white light. It was a flashlight. At first, my heart leaped. A search party? Another hiker? But as I watched the small, distant beam of light, the relief quickly morphed into a deep, primal unease. The light wasn't sweeping back and forth like someone searching for a trail. It wasn't bobbing randomly like a lost hiker stumbling over rocks. It was moving with terrifying purpose. It was moving in a perfectly straight, deliberate line, and it was heading directly toward the base of my tower. I crawled to the edge of the window, keeping my head below the sill, and watched. Whoever was holding that light was navigating incredibly dense, dangerous terrain in the pitch black without hesitating. They knew exactly where they were going. An hour passed. The light grew larger, cutting sharply through the trunks of the dead trees. They were about a mile away now. I desperately wanted to yell out, to ask who was there, but my instinct screamed at me to stay silent. You don't survive in the deep woods by making yourself a target. By 1 a.m., the light was at the edge of the clearing, directly below my tower. I held my breath, pressing my face against the cold, rotted wood of the floor, peering through the cracks between the floorboards. The beam of the flashlight swept across the rusted metal legs of the tower. It illuminated the dead leaves on the ground. Then, with a sharp click, the light snapped off. Total, suffocating darkness returned. I waited. 1 minute, 2 minutes, nothing. No voice calling out, no sound of footsteps walking away, just a heavy, unnatural silence. Then, I heard it, clang. The hollow, metallic groan of a heavy boot stepping onto the first rung of the metal staircase. They were climbing up. The footsteps were agonizingly slow, deliberate, heavy. They were ascending the first flight. My mind raced. There was nowhere to run. I was trapped in a wooden box 60 feet in the air. I scrambled silently across the floor to the heavy wooden trapdoor. It was the only way into the cabin. There was an old, rusted iron sliding latch on my side. With trembling hands, I slid the heavy metal bolt into place just as the footsteps reached the second landing. They were on the final flight of stairs. They were directly beneath the floorboards I was sitting on. I backed away into the darkest corner of the cabin, clutching my heavy metal water bottle, the only weapon I had. I pulled my knees to my chest, making myself as small as possible. The footsteps stopped on the catwalk right outside the trapdoor. I could hear the wooden planks of the catwalk creaking under their heavy weight. Then, a thick, raspy breathing. It was wet and labored, coming from just inches away, separated from me only by the rotted wood of the door. Slowly, the iron handle on the outside of the trapdoor began to turn. It rattled violently against the rusted latch I had just locked. When the door didn't open, the breathing stopped. For 10 seconds, there was absolute silence. Then, the person outside exploded into a violent frenzy. They began slamming their fists, or maybe a heavy tool, against the trapdoor with terrifying animalistic force. The entire cabin shook. Dust and splinters rained down on me from the ceiling. They pulled on the handle so hard the rusted screws began to groan and pull away from the rotting wood. They never said a word. They didn't yell, "Open up." They didn't curse. They just kept violently smashing against the door in total silence, the only sound being the wood splintering and their heavy, ragged breathing. The assault on the door lasted for 20 uninterrupted minutes. I sat in the corner, crying silently, completely paralyzed by terror, waiting for the wood to finally give way. But the old iron latch held. Suddenly, the banging stopped. The person dropped heavily onto the catwalk. I could hear them pacing outside the shattered windows for hours. Their heavy boots crunched on the frost-covered wood. I lay there, staring into the dark, watching the shadows shift, too terrified to blink. Sometime around 4 a.m., I heard the slow, heavy clang of them descending the metal stairs, fading back into the darkness. I didn't move an inch until the sun was fully up and burning brightly in the sky. Even then, I waited until noon before I finally gathered the courage to slide the iron bolt back and push open the trapdoor. The wood on the outside of the door was deeply gouged, scratched to hell as if someone had taken a crowbar or a hunting knife to it, trying to pry it open. I climbed down the rusted stairs so fast my hands bled from gripping the icy metal. When I reached the bottom landing, my stomach dropped. Arranged in a perfect, neat circle at the base of the stairs were dozens of sharp, jagged rocks. And sitting perfectly in the center of that circle was my compass. It must have fallen out of my bag when I was frantically climbing up the night before. They didn't just attack the door. They left a message to let me know they had been there, and they had my belongings. I found a stream, followed it west for 7 hours, and finally hit a logging road. I never went back for the rest of my gear. Whatever was in those woods didn't want to rob me. They wanted to hunt me. And the thought of what would have happened if that rusted iron latch had broken still keeps me awake at night. There is an unwritten rule among experienced backpackers. Never leave the marked trail. The Appalachian Trail is maintained, patrolled, and predictable. But the wilderness surrounding it, millions of acres of dense, unforgiving forest, is a chaotic labyrinth where people vanish every single year, never to be found. My name is Eric, and 5 years ago, I broke that rule. I was hiking a section of the Great Smoky Mountains in North Carolina during late autumn. The trail was beautiful, but it was crowded. I kept running into day hikers and loud college groups. I hiked to get away from people, to find absolute, unbroken solitude. So, on the third day, checking my compass and topographical map, I made a decision. I spotted a distant, densely wooded valley on the map that had no trails, no logging roads, and no water sources that would attract other campers. It was a dead zone. I stepped off the worn dirt path of the AT and pushed my way into the thick, untamed brush. Hiking off-trail is exhausting. You aren't walking, you are fighting the environment. For 4 hours, I battled through walls of thorny briars, climbed over massive, rotting deadfalls, and navigated steep, muddy ravines. By late afternoon, the canopy above me was so incredibly thick with ancient pine branches that the sunlight barely reached the forest floor. The ground was covered in a thick, spongy layer of dead, brown pine needles that absorbed all sound. It felt like walking through a massive, silent tomb. Eventually, I found a small, perfectly flat depression surrounded by massive boulders. It was the ideal hidden campsite. I dropped my heavy pack, my muscles aching, and started setting up my olive green tent. As I was clearing a spot for my sleeping pad, kicking away a thick pile of damp, decaying leaves, my boot hit something hard. It didn't sound like a rock. It sounded hollow, a dull, metallic thud. I knelt down and brushed the wet leaves away with my gloved hands. Sticking about 6 inches out of the dark earth was a rusted iron pipe. It was thick, maybe 8 inches in diameter, and capped with a crude, wire mesh screen. It looked like an old ventilation shaft. I sat back on my heels, staring at it. We were at least 10 miles from any road. There were no historical mining sites listed in this sector of the map. It made zero sense for heavy industrial piping to be buried out here in the middle of untouched wilderness. I leaned in close to the mesh screen. A faint, stale draft of air was rising out of the pipe. It smelled like wet concrete, old copper, and something sickeningly sweet, like rotting fruit. A heavy, uneasy feeling settled in my stomach, but the sun was setting rapidly. I convinced myself it was just debris from an old, forgotten moonshine operation from the 1920s. I pitched my tent right next to it, ate a cold dinner, and zipped myself in for the night. The darkness in the deep woods is absolute. It presses against your eyes. The silence was so profound that I could hear my own pulse thumping in my ears. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring up at the pitch-black ceiling of my tent, trying to sleep. Around 2 a.m., I woke up suddenly. I didn't hear a twig snap. I didn't hear an animal outside. I woke up because I could feel something. There was a very faint, rhythmic vibration traveling through the ground, directly into my sleeping pad. It was a low, mechanical hum. I held my breath, my entire body going rigid. I slowly unzipped my sleeping bag and pressed my bare ear directly against the cold floor of the tent. The sound was unmistakable. Coming from deep beneath the earth, right below my campsite, was the muffled, heavy thumping of a diesel generator. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. An underground bunker? A cartel drug lab? A prepper's hideout? Whatever it was active, and it was directly beneath me. But then, the terror escalated. Over the low hum of the generator, I heard something else drifting up through that rusted ventilation pipe outside my tent. It was music. It was faint, distorted by the pipe and the earth. The contrast was horrifying. Sitting in a freezing, pitch-black forest, miles from civilization, listening to cheerful, old-timey music, vibrating up from the dirt below my bed. I didn't sleep. I didn't move. I lay frozen in the dark for 5 straight hours, clutching my bear spray, listening to that muffled, cheerful music playing on a loop over and over, until the generator finally sputtered and died around dawn. When the pale morning light finally filtered through the nylon of my tent, the woods were dead silent again. The music was gone. The vibration had stopped. Every survival instinct I had was screaming at me to pack my bags and run. But human curiosity is a dangerous, stupid flaw. I had to know what was down there. I unzipped the tent and stepped out into the freezing morning mist. I walked over to the rusted ventilation pipe. In the daylight, it looked even more out of place. I started looking at the ground around the pipe. If there was a vent, there had to be an entrance. I noticed a subtle, unnatural, square-shaped depression in the earth about 10 feet away, completely covered by a massive mound of dead pine needles and broken branches. It looked like someone had intentionally swept the forest debris over this specific spot to hide it. I found a thick branch and started frantically scraping the layers of dead, wet leaves away. After a few minutes of digging, the branch scraped against something solid, not rock, metal. I dropped the branch and used my hands, tearing away the freezing dirt and roots until I uncovered a large, heavy steel hatch set flush into a thick concrete frame in the ground. The metal was painted a faded, military green, but it was heavily scarred and rusted around the edges. There was a thick, industrial iron handle welded to the center. I stood there, panting, staring down at this hidden doorway into the earth. My heart was hammering against my ribs. Someone was living down there. Someone had built a fortified underground structure miles off the grid. I stepped closer, my boots crunching on the dead leaves, and looked down at the locking mechanism. That is when the cold reality of the situation truly hit me. That is when my blood ran entirely cold. The hatch wasn't locked from the inside. Wrapped tightly around the iron handle, securing it to a heavy steel loop bolted into the concrete, was a massive, rusted, heavy-duty logging chain. And securing the chain was a giant brass padlock. The lock was on the outside. Whoever had built this bunker, whoever was playing that music down there in the dark, they couldn't get out. They were locked in. This wasn't a prepper's survival shelter. It wasn't a hidden cabin. It was a cage, an underground cell. My mind flashed with horrifying possibilities. Was someone trapped down there? Was it a victim? But the generator? Who filled the gas for the generator? Suddenly, the answer hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. The person inside didn't lock the door from the outside. The person who owns the cage does. And if the generator had been running all night, that meant it had fuel, which meant the person who held the key to that padlock came back here regularly to check on whatever, or whoever, was locked down there. And I had just spent the entire night camping directly on top of it. I had cleared the camouflage off their hidden door. Snap! A loud, distinct sound of a heavy branch breaking echoed through the quiet forest, coming from the dense tree line about 100 yards away. I didn't turn to look. I didn't grab my tent. I didn't even grab my expensive sleeping bag. I snatched my backpack, slung it over one shoulder, and ran. I ran with a blind, frantic, animalistic panic. I tore through the briars, thorns ripping at my face and jacket, ignoring the burning in my lungs. I didn't use my compass. I just ran in the general direction of the sunrise, knowing it would eventually lead me toward the highway. I ran for 3 straight hours until my legs gave out and I collapsed onto the marked dirt path of the Appalachian Trail, startling a group of day hikers. When I got back to town, I went straight to the local ranger station and told them everything. I gave them the exact GPS coordinates of where I had set up my tent. 2 days later, a ranger called me back. They had hiked out to the coordinates I provided. They found my abandoned, half-collapsed tent. They found the heavy indentations in the dirt where I had slept, but they didn't find the hatch. They said the ground was completely undisturbed, covered in a natural, thick layer of pine needles. They searched the entire valley and found no rusted pipe, no concrete slab, and no heavy metal door. I know what I saw, I know what I uncovered, and I know what I heard playing through the dirt that night. Whoever built that hatch didn't just hide it again, they buried it deeper. And every time I think about that cheerful 1950s music playing beneath the earth, I wonder if the person locked inside is still down there, waiting in the pitch black for the padlock to finally open.